I'm going to turn the podium over to Curtis.
Thank you, Naomi. And thanks to everyone for hosting me today and for the visit. I've enjoyed meeting many of you. I look forward to talking more with you. A question and answer after this. Or I guess, is there a little reception
yes.
too? Okay.
Thank you for reminding me.
We'll have a chance to talk more, I hope. So I'm excited. I'm gonna talk to you today about my work on quintillion, and even within classical studies, quintillion is often not much more than a name to many people, or at least he's not much more than a source of quotable quotes, like the one I've started us off with here. But of course, this audience may know quintillion better than some, because your colleague in classics, Sally Spence, wrote a book in which she used his theory of figurative language as a starting point for an exploration of our own rhetorical culture. But in general, quintillion is an author who is cited rather than read, an author who's mentioned rather than explored. And so today I want to talk about the traditional approaches to quintillion, point out some of their limitations, and propose a new way of reading his Institutio Oratoria that reveals his sophistication as a writer, and also shows how his conception of rhetoric intersects with the interests of these two departments. Quintillion lived in interesting times. He was born in Spain, and he came to Rome at a time when many people from the provinces were flowing into the city, where, unlike previous periods, they were able to rise to positions of power. Quintillion seems to have done this. He tells us in the Institutio Oratoria that he taught rhetoric for 20 years, and we can gauge the status he achieved not only from his distinguished students, but from the fact that he was the first teacher of rhetoric to receive a payment from the public treasury, from the emperor. And he refers to several oratorical cases he pleaded, and from this we infer that he had a parallel career as a practicing orator during his teaching career, and he even seems to have argued a case on behalf of the Emperor Titus's mistress, a further index of his moving in the highest imperial circles in Rome. The only work by Quintillion that has survived for us to read is his Institutio Oratoria, which is a 12-book treatise in which he promises to educate the perfect orator, starting from infancy, he says. And this work describes very thoroughly what we would now call a course in composition. It was aimed at public speaking, but he has sections on invention or techniques for discovering arguments and making arguments, a section on arrangement of those arguments, on the use of emotions and humor in argumentation, on the style in which you express your arguments, a very famous section in which he describes what authors you should read to become an orator. He has the most comprehensive ancient discussions of gesture, delivery, and memory. And finally, he has a section on the ethical considerations of the orator in persuasion. It's a very complete discussion, which has served as an essential repository of rhetorical techniques for historians of rhetoric, especially. The political context in which Quintillion wrote calls for special comment. He tells us at the beginning of his fourth book that he has just been made tutor to the heirs of the Emperor Domitian, again a marker of his prominence in Rome. But Domitian is known to history as a paranoid and tyrannical ruler who executed many dissidents and who was ultimately murdered by a conspiracy after he put his own cousin to death. He was the first emperor whose memory the Senate voted to have erased from history. Now, what's interesting about Quintillion is that there's no evidence that Domitian ever turned on Quintillion. And since even though he turned on so many other people in his age, and since the rhetorician never refers to the emperor's murder, Quintillion is usually supposed to have died before Domitian did. What's proven puzzling, however, about Quintillion is that in such a political climate, he offers to train his readers in the techniques of rhetoric that were developed in so different a context from his own. The techniques he describes were created by the sophists and categorized by Aristotle in connection with the development of democratic institutions in classical Athens. In Rome, these techniques found their, I think, fullest flourishing under the Roman Republic, which was not a democratic system by any means, but it was one in which deliberative oratory in the Senate and before the people seems to have shaped state policy and action. But that form of government, that republican form of government, had been replaced by monarchy when Augustus came to power more than a century before the Institutio Oratoria was published. And with a sole ruler governing the state, there do not seem to have been outlets for the kind of oratory that Quintilian teaches. In fact, even outlets for judicial rhetoric seem to have waned under the empire as the emperor himself took increasing control of the courts. And as a result of this apparent disconnect between Quintilian's content and his political context, he has been regarded throughout the 20th century at least, and I have some examples of this interpretation on the screen. He's been regarded as alternately an anachronistic writer, a nostalgist, politically naive, or when you get down to it, this is the bottom one, just not very smart. And it's this sense of Quintilian's anachronism or intellectual weakness, as Kennedy had it on the previous slide, that has authorized two ways of reading Quintilian, which are summarized, I think, very well by Teresa Morgan in the quote I have here, and which is also on your handout under section A. The first of these ways of reading him is to regard him, as she says, as a kind of likable pedagogue, or as the ideal schoolmaster. That is, a kind of humane and sincere teacher who wants nothing more than for his students to succeed. And she recognizes in this quote that this approach is built on the kind of condescension to Quintilian that I just described. As he's a good person, but he's not a real intellect. The other common approach is, in her useful metaphor, to mine his text for the information he can tell us about a whole range of ancient practices and attitudes. And that approach, this mining approach, is based no less on Quintilian's intellectual weakness because we feel more comfortable treating an unsophisticated writer as a transparent window onto his culture than we do a sophisticated writer. I'm going to turn now to a passage that reveals the limitations of both of these ways of reading and that illustrates how I think and argue that Quintilian needs to be read. And this is the preface to Book 6 of the Institutio Oratoria, which is section B on your handout. And I'm using translations from Donald Russell's Loeb edition, which I've occasionally modified to bring out some feature of the language that interests me. Here Quintilian is writing to the dedicatee of the Institutio to explain why he's taking so long in composing the treatise. He explains that he was making good progress, I guess through the first 5 books. He was making good progress until fortune dealt him a triple blow. First his wife died, that's described in the top passage there. Then his younger son died, described in the bottom passage there, and then his older son died. And his accounts of their deaths and his devastating grief has been called by one commentator listed here, it's been called the saddest thing in all of Latin literature. And it's prompted both kinds of readings that Morgan describes. In terms of the mining approach, we may first observe that this is by far the most detailed information we have about Quintilian's private life, which actually in turn plays into the ideal schoolmaster interpretation of his work, because his mournful praise of his wife and his tender adoration of his son seems to reveal his humanity. And we're kind of invited to believe that that humanity extends to the way he treats his students as well. And in fact, this personal and human presence of Quintilian, not only here but throughout his treatise, is one of the major differences between him and earlier rhetorical writers like Aristotle. Quintilian is much more self-consciously a teacher. He's present with the learner to a much greater extent, I think, than other ancient writers on the subject. And as we will see, his emphasis on this presence has significant implications for his theory of rhetoric. I may add that those who mine Quintilian may also find in his description of his wife's youth, this is at the bottom here, his description of his wife's youth, they find evidence for the practice of Roman men marrying much younger women, or in his boast that his son loved him even more than his grandmother who was bringing him up, they find evidence for grandparents' involvement in the lives of young children. So those are the kinds of things you can sort of learn about Rome from Quintilian. By the time Quintilian talks about his older son's death, he's nearly carried away by grief. This son who shared Quintilian's name had evidently, this is the top section, had evidently begun training to be an orator himself and had shown real promise. So all the more cruel then, his premature death, as Quintilian cries out. All this was only promise. He had other qualities already ripe: constancy, dignity, strength to face even pain and fear. With what courage, with what admiration on the part of his doctors did he bear his 8 months of illness? How he comforted me in his last hours. How, when he was failing and no longer part of our world, did the wanderings of his delirium dwell on school and on his studies? Oh, my unfulfilled hope, did I indeed see your fading eyes, your fleeting breath? Did I have strength to embrace your cold and lifeless body, to receive your last breath, and still myself breathe the common air? I who deserve to bear these torments and to think these thoughts? Quintilian's lament for his son continues to move his readers. In 2008, for example, Douglas Hassall observed, "There is something deeply affecting in the preface to Book 6, coming from a Roman consul and orator who was so grave, so reserved, so hardened by lengthy forensic practice as an advocate." However, when we consider where this deeply affecting passage appears in the Institutio as a whole, a more complicated picture emerges. Immediately after this preface, Quintilian begins to describe how the orator should use emotion. And his advice, which is also on your handout at section C, seems at many points not only to point to his own account of his grief in the preface to the book, but also to give us reason to question whether we believe that account. So for example, on this slide, he emphasizes the power of the appeal to pity. He recommends referring to both current and past sufferings to evoke that pity. He specifies that one should invoke their children and other relatives, which presumably would include a wife. Quintilian did all of this himself in his preface. Quintilian's discussion here is focused on judicial rhetoric, in which the orator is called on to describe the suffering not of himself, but of his client. But he then goes on to employ a theatrical metaphor in Haas parte subit, to suggest that the orator himself might sometimes need to enter into the character of the suffering man. And as Quintilian expands on the need for the orator to employ fictions in his representation of suffering, when he expands on the need to pretend, on the ability of the skilled orator to make the judge think that he is hearing the feelings and voice of the afflicted, and reiterates his comparison of the orator to stage actors, he sows further doubt about whether we have seen the real Quintilian in the preceding preface, or whether the saddest thing in Latin literature might in fact be a virtuoso display of all the techniques the orator knows for creating emotions in an audience. And so when Quintilian declares that the orator speaks behind the persona, we recognize not only the Latin word for the theatrical mask, but a word we all still use to describe the way that someone can represent themselves as something they're not. Later in that same book, Quintilian returns to the importance of fiction in oratorical training and to the theatrical metaphors that underlie the theory of emotion. And then, to conclude his discussion, this is sort of this section here. To conclude his discussion, he brags in his characteristically understated way that as an orator, he possessed a particular skill when it came to creating emotions in an audience. That he has often been moved to the point of being overtaken not only by tears, but by pallor and by a grief which is not his own, but which is very like the real thing. This boast, I think, leaves no doubt that we are meant to recognize that Quintilian is not only teaching us how to create emotions in an audience, but is also parading the fact that he is a master of these techniques himself, as the long history of scholars admiring the pathos of his preface shows. And so if Quintilian's account of emotions can be criticized for lacking the systematic rigor of Aristotle, Quintilian has nothing like Aristotle's definitions of emotions and their opposites, or explanations of the circumstances in which people feel that emotion and the kinds of people toward whom those emotions are felt. If Quintilian lacks that kind of systematic rigor of Aristotle, perhaps we've misunderstood what he's trying to accomplish. Those looking for a systematic theory of rhetoric might turn to Aristotle, or in Latin to the Rhetorica ad Herennium. But what Quintilian gives us is a blending of theory and practice, of instruction and performance. Perhaps we are meant to read Quintilian's account of pathos in connection with his own highly pathetic life story. It's not even right to think of passages of instruction and performance as two discrete things in Quintilian. As I hope this slide can show, even his account of the deaths of his children is saturated with technical rhetorical terminology. So when he claims that he doesn't want to exaggerate his troubles and in fact longs to diminish them, the verbs that he uses, augere and minuendi, are both the technical terms for the rhetorical techniques of amplification and diminution. His older son, the budding orator, in his death throes, is engaged in the rhetorical form of consolatio, this sort of fixed form that people practice in the rhetorical schools. And when Quintilian ponders abandoning the institutio because of his grief, he persuades himself to continue heroically with the well-worn topos of the solace of literary work. His display of rhetorical technique is also a catalog of techniques, keyed to the technical language of instruction. And we find this not just in the preface to Book 6, but throughout the whole work. So for example, when Quintilian discusses how to begin a speech, he advises the orator on techniques to make the audience attentive. And he recommends that the way to do this is to make reference to the new, the novum, and the important, the magnum. And then when we look at the way that Quintilian begins various books of his own treatise, we find that he has followed his own advice. So for example here, when he refers to his new reason for diligence at the beginning of Book 4, when he announces that he has been made tutor to Domitian's heirs. And at various points, which I've enumerated there throughout the rest of the work, where he declares that the current book is dealing with ever more important topics, always using this word magnum, some form of this word magnum that he has said is kind of the key word for gaining the audience's attention. Similarly, Quintilian recommends that at the beginning of a speech, the orator should not convey too much self-confidence, shouldn't convey too much fiducia, because it can come off as arrogance. And so sure enough, at the very beginning of his work, in the preface to the very first book, Quintilian relates that when his friends asked him to compose something on rhetoric, he agreed to do it not because of his confidence that he could accomplish it, not because of his fiducia, but because he was too shy to refuse their request. He had this veracundia. So at the very beginning, he disowns the very thing that he says orators should disown at the beginning of their speech, and he replaces it with veracundia, which, as you can see in Book 11, he'll later say, this is actually the best way to get an audience's goodwill, is to have that quality, that kind of all shucks shyness. As a final example relating to beginnings, we can note this Quintilian. This is the right one, yeah. Quintilian specifies that another good way for a speaker to earn an audience's goodwill is to emphasize that he is pleading his client's case out of obligation to a friend, as a way of conveying his honorable motives in entering into this judicial situation. And by now, I don't think will surprise anyone that Quintilian says, as I mentioned before, that it was in response to a request from friends that he's writing this treatise in the first place. And that he in fact goes on to refer multiple times to the bond of friendship that he shares with the book's dedicatee, Marcus Vittorius, yet again displaying his own oratorical techniques in his own self-presentation. This use of his own rhetorical techniques and the way he connects that use to his theory through the use of the same terminology is so plain to see that to me it is surprising how rarely scholars have recognized the rhetoric of Quintilian's presentation. And I have here a quote from James Murphy, who has done more than almost anyone for the study of Quintilian, but even he has this blind spot. Here we see him recognizing that a dedication to a friend is a common rhetorical topos in Latin literature, but for some reason, in the case of Quintilian, he prefers to conclude that in this case, Quintilian may be responding to an actual request from a friend. Quintilian is apparently so persuasive that we want to believe everything he says. Now, even though scholarship has largely ignored this rhetorical dimension to Quintilian's treatise, it's not in itself surprising that he would use all these techniques, because he was, as we said, a practicing orator at the same time that he was teaching rhetoric. But if we turn to Quintilian's description of these two roles, the teacher and the orator, we find that their priorities and methods are deeply at odds with each other, and that this conflict forces us to reconsider what Quintilian's purpose in composing his treatise might have been. This slide shows part of Quintilian's discussion of the ideal teacher. He lists several desirable qualities that this teacher should have, including that he should be simplex in docendo, that he should be straightforward in his teaching. And then Quintilian, ideal schoolmaster that he is, invites us in the final chapter of his treatise to see his own work in that light, as he declares that he has, as far as his modest powers have allowed, set out frankly and simpliciter, straightforwardly, everything that he knows about rhetoric. But when we recognize the extent to which Quintilian's didactic practice is soaked in rhetorical techniques, when we recognize that the Institutio Oratoria is in essence an oratorical performance, we're forced to recognize that Quintilian is as much an orator as a teacher. And when we look at the account of the work of oratory, we find something deeply at odds with the straightforwardness he demands of a teacher. The orator's job, as he says on this slide, is to apply force to the minds of the judges and to distract them from the contemplation of truth. And then in the second passage on this slide, when he's discussing the figured language at the heart of much of rhetoric, he compares two different styles of sword fighting. One which approaches its opponent head on and deals in, here's that word again, straightforward blows. And that's sort of one model. But that the orator's mode is something quite different, one that uses side strokes and feints that are less easy to detect and employs a varied approach so as to attack the flanks or the rear or draw off the defense. And here's a place where Russell's translation is really great. The orator, in his words, will duck to deceive. So if a teacher is someone that we feel we should trust to have our educational development and indeed our best interests at heart, the orator is something altogether different in Quintilian's terms. And scholarship's emphasis on Quintilian's exaltation of the vir bonus dicendi peritus, the ethically good orator, has, I think, distracted us from the fact, which is brought out by Michael Vickers in an unpublished paper listed in your bibliography, that what Quintilian does is he doesn't at all sugarcoat how the orator achieves his ends. We've already seen that he acknowledges that an orator must distract the judge from the truth and use cunning. In a later passage, he admits that the judge must sometimes be deceived. And more importantly for us, as we consider what the aims of this orator in the guise of the teacher might be, Quintilian also says that the orator must work to make his audience think that he is accomplishing one thing when he is in fact accomplishing something else. So is this book a treatise on rhetoric by a likable pedagogue, as Quintilian seems to want us to think? Or is it something else altogether? This is why the traditional ways of reading Quintilian are inadequate for the Institutio Oratoria. If we regard him as the ideal schoolmaster, we're taking Quintilian's representation of himself at face value, and we are imputing to him sincerity, even as he gives us the tools to recognize the rhetorical constructiveness of his self-presentation, and calls attention to the fact that he is constructing it. Put another way, in the terms of this second quote I've had here, we're cooperating with Quintilian when we sort of read him straight, complying perhaps too readily with the same rhetoric that Quintilian tells us himself is coercive and deceptive. But the miming approach is perhaps even worse, in that it willfully ignores that same rhetoric and attempts to treat Quintilian as a transparent window onto ancient practices. Some of the models of communication developed by theorists in communication studies are useful for thinking about this limitation of that reading. If we read Quintilian as a transparent documentary source, we're adopting a kind of transmission model of communication, in which Quintilian is sending us a message about antiquity, and all we have to do is receive it. Something like the constructivist approach proposed by Delia and O'Keeffe is much more appropriate. Such a model recognizes that the transmitted message cannot be separated from the interpretive schemes that individuals bring to that act of communication. And such a model allows us to recognize not only that Quintilian himself is providing interpretive schemes that we may accept or not, but also that we ourselves apply such schemes to the way we read Quintilian. For example, whether we treat technical treatises differently than we would treat a book of poems or a historical narrative. Ultimately, whatever Quintilian we find is the product of the interaction between these schemes. Indeed, it seems to me that because Quintilian demonstrates that his existence as a teacher is not separable from the audience's understanding of his representation of himself as a teacher, that we could even see in him something like a proto-theorist of Robert Craig's constitutive model of communication, by which ancient Rome itself is created, that is, constituted, by the way we communicate with Quintilian, and all the other evidence we use to understand it. In fact, I would argue that Quintilian provides us a model for how he wants to be read, in opposition to this traditional ways, in his discussion of how we should read different kinds of texts. This is section D on our handout, where he says that a speech, or oratio, and I have been arguing here that the institutio is in some sense a speech, needs to be read with the understanding that its author will conceal its virtues, and that you may not understand why he has done what he has done until you reach the end, at which moment I think immediately of Book 6, where the introductory preface, the part that comes first, employs techniques of pathos that then in the subsequent chapters he theorizes. And so it would make sense that Quintilian's particular purpose might not become clear until the end of his work, where I argue he explains what his reader should get out of the rhetorical training he has offered. In the second passage on this slide, which comes almost at the end of the 12th and final book of the work, Quintilian is describing how the fully trained orator should interact with his clients. The client will tell the orator his side of the story, and the orator should listen carefully, but eventually he needs to change his roles from ally to adversarius, to adversary. And he must devote his energy to detecting the rhetoric in his client's construction of the facts. To sum up, Quintilian says, the advocate best at learning a case is the skeptic. And the technical term for learning a case is discendo, the same word that describes what students do with their teachers, and I would argue what we do when we read a didactic text like the Institutio Oratoria. We learn. And so what Quintilian is doing is inviting us to a skeptical mode of learning, one in which we use the techniques of rhetoric that he has taught us to recognize his own use of those techniques and ultimately to become his adversary in the way he's using those techniques. He's not training us to use rhetoric. He's training us to recognize and resist the rhetoric that is applied to us, beginning with that of Quintilian himself. This self-reflexive and even self-undermining approach to rhetoric allows us to see Quintilian in a variety of new lights. First of all, he emerges as a figure with much more in common than has previously been noted with the rhetoricians of the Second Sophistic, when, in Simon Goldhill's account, rhetoric was not simply a skill or a field, but a fundamental medium for the circulation of ideas, the circulation of power, and the performance of the self in the public life of the empire. This last point about the performance of the self reminds me in particular of the way that Quintilian is always calling attention to his work of self-representation. And his invitation to students to apply their skepticism to every authoritative account of knowledge, including his own, verges on something like what Macaro calls a critical rhetoric, which demystifies the conditions of domination, as Quintilian does by empowering his students to recognize the power that rhetorical representations exercise over them, but which also leads to what Macaro calls the prospect of permanent criticism, a self-reflexive criticism that turns back on itself, a never-ending skepticism that is a healthy response to a society which takes universalist dogma and the truths it yields for granted. This formulation is very useful to me in that it explains why Quintilian's self-reflexive approach to rhetoric does not seem to have an endpoint. By pulling back the veil on the operation of rhetoric, he undermines not just coercive authority, but actually all kinds of authority. And Quintilian perhaps recognized with Macaro that the new social relations that might emerge from a reaction to a critique are themselves simply new forms of power, and hence subject to renewed skepticism. It's a worldview appropriate for a man writing in an imperial age with no real prospect of radical political revolution. And of course, none came, even as Domitian was violently replaced by a series of emperors who are known to history as the good emperors, but who were totalitarian monarchs nonetheless. Far from being politically naive or anachronistic, Quintilian is a writer deeply and critically engaged with the political reality of his time. And this is ultimately how Quintilian's concept of the role of rhetoric in his time can speak to our own concerns about engaged citizenship in ours. Ever since Habermas introduced the idea of a public sphere and its ideal speech situation as an ideal of deliberative democracy, democratic theory has focused on ways in which our contemporary moment does not achieve that ideal. Many aspects of the idea of a public sphere have been criticized in many ways, but that debate over its precise nature has produced a useful list of the desirable features of deliberative institutions. Dahlberg provides a synthesis of these conditions, several of which are relevant to understanding how Quintilian fits in his political context. These are reasoned critique, sincerity, formal inclusion, discursive equality, and autonomy from state and corporate interests. The contemporary American political landscape appears to lack such opportunities for deliberation. Reasoned critique is hard to find. Sincerity is doubted, and in particular due to the increasing amount of money being spent on political messaging, inclusiveness, discursive equality, and autonomy from corporate interests seem weak or non-existent. The concentration of power to homogeneous mass media managed by corporations seems to be a feature of this post-deliberative landscape. I argue that Quintilian writes in a parallel situation, and so would have a lot to say about ours. Like Habermas, he writes in an age that looks back on prior generations' deliberative institutions. For Habermas, this was the 18th and 19th century with its emerging middle classes. For the Flavian age in which Quintilian lived, this was, as I remarked earlier, the Roman Republic, when deliberation in the form of public and judicial oratory was practiced. And Quintilian's age, too, is one in which dissent, deliberative institutions, and participation in governance were all severely curtailed by the concentration of power in the hands of the emperor and his apparatus. Sometimes this power was manifested in violence and force. I already mentioned that Domitian seems to have executed or exiled historians and poets and various other kinds of people. But just as often since the time of Augustus, the first emperor, the power of the emperor was established and maintained through the control of representations in all media in Rome, whether literary, historical, architectural, sculptural, or ritual. And on this slide, I show just one of the most famous of the many monuments to imperial ideology from the time of the emperors, Augustus's Areopagus, with its panels laden with nationalist and mythological images that announce a golden age, with Augustus himself represented at the head of a solemn ritual procession. This may not be a rhetoric of words, but it is no less recognizable as a rhetorical representation for Quintilian's readers to demystify. We don't, or don't seem to, live under monarchy as Quintilian did, but the emperor's control over representations may be seen as in some sense analogous to the control exercised by the wealthy and well-connected corporate and political interests that dominate our own media. We might say that the Roman emperors, just as much as any political party or news outlet, recognized with Entman in your bibliography, the role of framing effects, agenda setting, and priming. In Entman's analysis, these all fit together as tools of power. It would be fascinating to read the panels of the Areopagus in those terms. Quintilian's treatise, then, which trains readers to recognize the rhetorical constructiveness of any authoritative act or statement, including its own, is written for a culture in which the citizen is constantly bombarded by rhetorically constructed representations. In Rome might include what the natural power structure is for Rome, and what it should be, what it means to be Roman, and so forth. That is, the Institutio Oratoria was written for those who were, as my title has it, living in a rhetorical world. And our world is no less rhetorical today. Indeed, the citizenry of America has no more occasion to use political rhetoric than did the orator of Quintilian's time, living under imperial rule. What we do have is occasion to recognize the rhetoric being applied to us. And this, then, is the value of a self-reflexive rhetorical education of the type offered by Quintilian. The same value, actually, as the type that we can offer. It teaches one to navigate the culture where rhetorical representation is the coin of the realm, in which the ability to decode is as important as the ability to create.